which will address the concern that was raised by Deputy, and those options will be provided for the working group consideration and discussion. Let's go to slide number 6, please. The next one. Yes. Before we discuss the revised set of options, it is important for me to highlight what is the current level of grant compensation and what is the impact for the donor and for the ADF countries. First of all, it's very important to say that the grant compensation is critical for the ADF financial sustainability and ADF financial capacity. Grant compensation are factored in the advanced commitment capacity. As you know, this is really a key component for the size of the ADF replenishment. Existing and future grant compensation contributions are also embedded in the ADF market borrowing modeling that was approved by the Deputy and will be a critical component for the ADF future rating. Existing grant compensation represent around 11.5 billion commitment by the end of ADF-17. And for future grant compensation, it represents at least UA 1.6 billion per replenishment. So you can imagine that the cancellation of those concessional resources will mainly be detrimental for the red light country and also for the financial sustainability of the ADF. Specifically for the ADF where, contrary to institution peers, most of the beneficiary countries are still facing debt sustainability issues. Just to give an example, in 2023, out of the 37 ADF countries, 21, almost more than half, were red light country in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. We should also see the current context where the grant compensation, based on the projection that you can see on this slide, are relatively small to some extent with regard to the high positive development impact that they can have on the ADF country. And the largest contribution are expected in ADF 25, that will be around 2052. And at that time, you will see that the average, we compute that the average grant compensation payable per donor will be on average UA 52 million in 2052. And the grant compensation payable by the largest ADF donor will be 215 million. That should be put in the context of the ADF. Let's go to slide number 7 now, where I will present the few options that management proposed for your consideration. Let's start by the first option, which is to maintain the status quo. Why? Actually, management believes that maintaining the current grant compensation framework provides the best trade-off in preserving the interests of all the main stakeholders. As it is, the mechanism is beneficial to ADF countries. Grant compensation is critical for the financial sustainability of the ADF, as I already indicated. The volume of grant compensation is relatively small with regard to the positive impact. And it is very important at the time when G20 called for more concessional financing, and also given the current debt sustainability situation of ADF countries. We also propose a second option, which is more or less to keep the option 1, but with some amendment. And the main amendment will be to exclude the compensation from additional grant that will be provided by the market borrowing option. As you remember, when we present the market borrowing option, there was this process of crop subsidization where we get resources from the market, and based on that, we will provide additional grant to ADF countries. So those grants will not be part of the grant compensation with this option. The main benefit for donor will be the reduction of the level of their grant compensation payment by approximately 300 million per replenishment. But on another side, that will also mean a loss of the same UA 300 million for the fund if the grant compensation that we provide to ADF through market borrowing is not compensated by another alternative measure. The third option that we are proposing for your consideration is to substitute grants currently provided to red light country with highly concessional loan. That will be a structural shift from the current practice. On that option, ADF will just provide 7.5% grant from its replenishment resources, as it was the case before ADF-9. And the remaining resources will be extended to in the form of highly concessional loan, which we believe we can find something which is more concessional than the highly concessional loan that I provided to yellow country. So if there's appetite for this, management will come back with a new instrument specifically for red light country. The main advantage of this option will be the elimination of grant compensation for donors, because going forward, we will just provide highly concessional loan to red country and no more grant. However, that reduction of that will lead to the reduction of the concessionality of the overall resources that we provide to red light country. And additional work also need to be done to ensure the consistency with the current DSF framework. The fourth option is to revisit the grant compensation formula. So we will keep the system as it is, but we will review the way that the grant compensation are computed. What we propose will be to have two levels of compensation to provide a better balance among the donors. The first component will be a flat contribution for each donor depending of their contribution category, whether it is small, medium, or high or large contributor. And the remaining contribution will be allocated on the burden sharing basis as it is currently the case. The main reason of this option is that currently it is the donors that contribute the most for the replenishment that are also asked to put additional compensation. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, in addition to these four options, management proposed two measures that will mitigate the impact of potential reduction or potential cancellation of grant contribution in future replenishment. The first measure is an upfront grant compensation. Currently, the mechanic is that the donor compensates the fund based on what we call the pay-as-you-go basis. With the upfront grant approach, all grant compensation payment will be made during the replenishment with a discount rate to calculate the present value of the current future commitment. The main advantage for donor, if we go to that option, will be the elimination of future liability due to grant compensation obligation. In addition, the discount that will be provided will reduce the total amount of grant compensation for donor. we provide an example where in the document where if this measure was applied at ADF-17, for example, it will have reduced the grant compensation from UA 1.5 billion based on the pay-as-you-go basis approach to only UA 1.1 billion based on an upfront basis approach, representing a reduction of approximately 400 million per replenishment for donors. The second measure that we propose will be to shorten the encashment schedule. For example, management proposed that we could reduce the current 10-year encashment schedule for 3-year encashment schedule. That will be, for example, in line of the encashment schedule of IFAD. The ADF will invest that temporary excess of liquidity to generate additional treasury income, which will increase the value of donor contributions. It is estimated that adopting a 3-year encashment schedule will increase the value of donor contribution by around 10% over 10 years. Next slide, please. In conclusion, the working group is invited to provide its view on the option and measure presented and summarized in this slide. Thank you for your attention.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Directeur, pour cette présentation brève mais très informative qui résume l'essentiel des propositions faites par le management à travers le nouveau document ou papier sur le Grant Compensation. Donc, comme prévu par l'agenda, nous ouvrons à présent la discussion pour mesdames et messieurs les plénipotentiaires pour intervenir. Donc, je vais, si vous le voulez bien, établir une première liste d'intervenants, y compris les pays qui nous suivent en ligne, l'Afrique du Sud, la Turquie et la France. Donc, la parole à qui veut bien la prendre. Merci.
It is working. It's working a bit too well. Thank you for chairing the meeting and arranging it today, and for all the work that's been done for the paper. I should start by saying I'm no longer the ADF deputy. I'm covering for Chris Bold, who's now playing that role, but I couldn't resist getting involved again. Look, I think from our perspective, we think we need a bigger African Development Fund. It needs to grow over time, and the question really is how we get there. And that's quite a question beyond this conversation, but then we need to think about what that means for grant compensation. When we talked about this during the replenishment 2 years ago now, I think that the bit of homework that a number of us set the bank was to talk to some of the donors and sort of understand how donors go about setting pledges, and then report back to us on some of that. It'd be useful to hear if you've had some of those conversations and what you've learned from those. It strikes me as a certain school of thought out there that some donors develop a pledge by automatically putting in whatever they're required to do in terms of grant compensation, and then make an additional pledge on top of that based on targeting a certain amount of burden share. I think actually in reality that's not how most donors work. It's certainly not how we work as the UK. We sort of try and get as much budget as we can internally, and that will be our pledge, and some of that gets allocated to grant compensation based on a formula, but that's not a driver for how much we put in. I think for most other donors, I know certainly some of my neighbours, that's the same as well. So I think that's important, that the fund I don't think is going to get extra money by retaining grant compensation. On the flip side, I think you have quite a risk actually for some donors like ourselves. So for the UK, I mean, the presentation pointed out that grant compensation is currently very small and it's not going to become huge. But actually for the UK, it's currently 22 million UA for ADF-16. By ADF-25, it would reach 215 million UA, which is like a third of our current pledge. So it's quite a substantial amount. And what you could have is a country like the UK making a pledge a very big pledge and getting the same burden share in that replenishment as a donor putting in a lot less money. And I can imagine our ministers at that time looking at that and saying, well, why are we putting in so money and our voting share is so much less? So I think you actually run a risk of this grant compensation as it stands, creating a disincentive or creating a sort of an aversion from some donors wanting to put money into the ADF. So that's the risk. So I'll leave that as the overall frame, and it'd be useful to hear from others in the room about how they make their own pledges, but also to hear from you, Hastu, and the team about what you've learned from your conversations with other donors. On the options, I think for the reasons I've just described, I don't think option one is viable. I think on option two, around only applying grant methodology to the non-leveraged funds, I think that's a given. I think from our perspective, we hadn't sort of thought that it would be applied more widely. On option three, substituting grants for highly concessional loans, I think it's an interesting idea. It's one that IDA deputies are discussing this year at the moment. But I think the driver for that shouldn't be this grant compensation issue. It should be something that's discussed by deputies properly in the round as part of the replenishment next year, not driven by an attempt to sort of control grant compensation. So I think that needs separating out, even though it's an interesting idea to look at. And then option four, I think would be interesting to see more analysis around some of those options. But I think we'd also say, from our perspective, the idea of taking grant compensation fully out of the replenishment, as has been done by the ADF, not the ADF, you're the ADF, as has been done by IDA and some of the other concessional funds, I think should stay on the table as an option, just to avoid this perverse issue where you have some donors putting in, pledges but getting a lot less voting share than other donors in future replenishments. Thanks. I'm sorry if it's talking so long.
Merci à la Grande-Bretagne. La parole est aux États-Unis. Merci.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to management for the very clear paper and presentation, and thank you to Phil for making a lot of points that I will also share. We welcome that management acknowledged that we need to think outside the box on grant compensation, but what we're talking about here is really just changing the size of the box or the shape of the box a little bit. We're still very much in the box. And so just a couple of first principles. Along the lines of what Phil said, we support a robust, hopefully growing, relevant and impactful ADF, and we want to have a framework that helps us get there as a collective of donors. We also reiterate that the fund should provide grants to the poorest RMCs with high debt sustainability risks. We think that should be fundamental to the offer that the fund is making, and it's part of the core comparative advantage. And then we also cannot pre-commit to providing a certain level of resources in future replenishments, as we've said, just the market borrowing discussions and others. And so for some of those reasons, this is why we've had concerns about the grant compensation framework since its inception in ADF-9. And we also see a need to fundamentally rethink the framework, as we too are quite skeptical about whether it's sustainable and viable for donors over the medium term. We see the same perverse incentives that Phil just mentioned for large donors. Politically, the reality is it's going to become increasingly untenable for us to argue that if we say that we give $1 to ADF, but it also puts us on the hook for 25 cents in contributions down the line, when we can give $1 to IDA and not be on the hook for compensation. Even if there's, you put aside the relative merits and the signaling, but the political reality is that it's going to be hard to argue and for both that and then what Phil was saying about the burden shares for donors that have to pay a large share of compensation. We also would be interested in the conversations about how donors set their pledges and how many basically set an envelope for each replenishment and just say, take the grant compensation from that, which will become more and more difficult. The core contributions will go down as the compensation amounts go up. And then it would be useful to see financial analysis of the impact on the fund from all other alternatives to the current framework. We, in terms of the additional options in the paper, option one is not viable to us. Option two, we also just kind of assumed that those would not be included in the grant compensation framework. So support excluding the market borrowing option, provide additional additional grants. On option 3, we are very wary of shifting red light countries to long-term credits. We're making the same point in IDA. We're concerned about the added burden on overall debt stock and debt management capacity from shifting the most fragile and vulnerable countries with the least capacity to needing to manage non-restructurable credits with terms that are longer than the history of the bank group. That kid that's in the picture on the presentation will be near retirement by the time these things are nearing the end of their term. We don't see the if staying within the current framework or something similar, we would favor a more fairly shared compensation formula. So if that's the direction we're taking, we would at least like to explore that more. We don't necessarily see the upfront NPV option as more attractive, though it does address the concern about pre-committing resources to future replenishments. But something that moves away from the current framework may have similar effects and could be more attractive. We could consider some modifications to encashment schedules, though that's not ideal in our view, and we would not necessarily support shortening all the way to a 3-year schedule, which would have pose issues for us in terms of our own budget timing and the current schedules that we have for replenishment negotiations. Then among other aspects of the framework that we'd like to maybe think about some more is why 7.5%, which doesn't really have a sound analytical basis. It just happened to be the level of technical assistance grants that was provided in ADF-8. That it doesn't really have a sound argument behind it now. And then just a bit of a wording issue that we do have quite a few concerns about the characterization in the paper that a grant made by ADF is essentially covered by donors taking on a debt to the fund. I know that's just a simplification for illustrative purposes, but it does have potentially significant legal and political connotations. So just avoiding that wording in future documentation would be appreciated. Thank you, and we look forward to further iterations of what a reformed vision might look like.
Merci, les États-Unis. Donc, nous avons en ligne l'Afrique du Sud qui demande la parole, suivi de la France, puis des Pays-Bas.
Thank you very much, Chair, and apologies for not being able to join you, but thank you very much to management for making the hybrid link possible. It's much appreciated. We'd also like to thank management for providing the paper and the presentation earlier on. We'd like to just take a step back in terms of ADF and the importance that it has on the continent. And we see that ADF will continue to be a critical instrument to support Africa's development. And we see it becoming increasingly strategic as we continue efforts towards achieving Agenda 2030. Africa's sustainable financing gap until 2030 is estimated at about 1.6 trillion USD. The continent needs an additional financing of approximately $194 billion annually to achieve its sustainable development goals. And this is within the context of an increasingly constrained global economic climate. In 2022, official development assistance, which continues to represent a major source of external financing in ADF countries, fell by more than 3.5% between 2021 and 2022. Therefore, the grant allocations from ADF will become increasingly important. As was earlier mentioned by Phil, other concessional funds like IDA are considering reviewing the grant allocations to countries that are in debt distress. The ADF grant compensation mechanism, which has underpinned the ADF's capacity to be a consistent and reliable provider of concessional finance to the ADF countries, remains important. Therefore, any decision taken in these discussions should not negatively impact the financial sustainability of the fund and reduce its financing capacity in the future. In addition, the decisions taken should not decrease the concessionality of the fund. Within this context, we do not think that it is viable to consider replacing grants to red light countries. In our view, this option would not only exacerbate the debt crisis in ADF countries, but will have a significant impact on the developmental outcomes that we are striving for. Therefore, we would not be supportive of taking option 3 any further. We do, however, share the concerns raised by deputies on the increasing levels of the grant compensation payments, and we're open to discuss options 2 and 4 further. We would appreciate elaboration of these 2 options and to provide scenarios to better understand how they would impact grant compensation payments in the future, and also the kinds of implications that it would hold for ADF recipient countries. We're also open to the complementary measures suggested to review the grant compensation payment schedule, and we're open to any payment schedule that safeguards the financial integrity of the ADF and does not negatively affect allocations made to ADF countries. We're also of the view that any significant changes to the ADF grant compensation mechanism should be considered in parallel or after the review of the ADF's financial policies that are to be developed for the implementation of the market borrowing option. Thank you.
Merci, Afrique du Sud. Donc, la parole est à la France. D'accord. Donc, en attendant juste de résoudre ce petit souci technique, la parole est à présent donnée à la Suisse.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to management to the revised paper. While we welcome the additional options, we need more details and analysis before being able to consider them further. We agree with others that maintaining the status quo is not an option. And so we still see merit to examine in greater detail the consequences of abandoning the grant compensation mechanism altogether and add this as a further option in the revised paper. So we encourage management to provide a comprehensive analysis for each of the 3 reform options, which clearly outlines the trade-offs and consequences for donor contributions, the fund's concessionality, and its financial capacity. The analysis should also consider the trade-off between grant compensation and the level of net resources provided to the fund. Specifically, with regards to option 3, we also encourage management to take into account the ongoing revision of the debt sustainability framework at the World Bank and the IMF, and take into account the discussions on the grant allocation framework currently taking place at IDA and strive for a harmonized approach. With regards to upfront payments, I think we need to better understand how upfront payments would impact the size of a particular replenishment and how sensitive the calculations and the discount rate are to external shocks or the interest rate environment. Lastly, on the encashment schedule, we see no merit in shortening the encashment schedule to 3 years. And I think the schedule has proven to work well and accommodates the fiscal constraints of donor countries. Thank you very much.
Merci, la Suisse. Donc, je pense qu'on peut revenir à la France si le souci technique est résolu.
Pardon, excusez-moi, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Et là, c'est bon. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Navré pour ce souci technique. Donc, je reprends ce que je disais tout à l'heure et merci d'avoir passé d'autres collègues en attendant. Bon, déjà, merci beaucoup merci Monsieur le Président et merci à la Banque africaine de nous permettre d'assister à ce groupe de travail de façon hybride. Merci au groupe de travail d'avoir précisé et développé les propositions qu'on avait déjà ébauchées lors de notre dernière réunion. Je vais me joindre à mes collègues du Royaume-Uni et des États-Unis qui ont fait quasiment tous les commentaires qu'on souhaitait faire. D'une part, en introduction, dire que ce mécanisme de compensation, c'est sûr qu'il est disons, intrinsèquement assez défavorable aux donateurs et assez spécial dans son essence à comprendre. Bon, ça, c'est pour le commentaire, disons, liminaire. Nous, ce qu'on peut ce qu'on veut rappeler déjà en préambule également, c'est que dans tous les cas, quelle que soit la mesure, les mesures choisies, on souhaite évidemment préserver l'identité constitutionnelle du FAD et faire en sorte que les pays qui en ont le plus besoin bénéficient toujours de suffisamment de ressources subventionnelles. Ce dont on serait preneur pour les prochaines réunions, tout simplement, c'est une évaluation quantitative de l'impact de ces mesures, à la fois sur les côtés donneurs et côté pays bénéficiaires. Après, si je peux faire des commentaires rapidement, donc option par option, sur l'exclusion de la compensation des dons pour les montants levés par le FAD sur les marchés. Je pense qu'on est un peu sceptique sur le concept, notamment du fait que, enfin, pour nous, ce qui est emprunté sur les marchés doit ensuite être en remboursé et on ne l'envisageait pas tellement comme un instrument de don. Donc, on serait preneur de détails sur cette mesure et l'impact que ça aurait éventuellement sur les ressources globales du FAD. Sur l'application du plafond de 7,5% pour les dons très concessionnels, nous, mais je pense que ça a été largement évoqué, hein, notre préoccupation, c'est évidemment la situation de surendettement ou le risque élevé de surendettement de certains pays. Donc, il faut bien doser l'opportunité de leur proposer des prêts plutôt que de la subvention. Concernant la revue de la formule d'allocation, alors on n'est pas opposé à l'idée sur le principe, surtout si elle permettrait d'alléger le poids pour certains pays de l'augmentation des contributions au FAD. Mais on a besoin tout simplement de précision là-dessus. Et enfin, un dernier commentaire sur les mesures additionnelles que vous proposez. Donc, on est ouvert à regarder pour un paiement anticipé. On trouve que la réduction de 10 à 3 ans, c'est peut-être un peu trop pour nous. Et donc, on serait preneur de chiffrage sur de l'impact sur une mesure peut-être plus modérée à, par exemple, 6 ans. Et je vais m'arrêter là. Merci encore pour cette réunion et pour tous les échanges.
Merci. Donc, prochain à prendre la parole, c'est l'Espagne, suivi de la Belgique. Vous m'excuserez si je n'ai pas noté dans l'ordre la prise de parole, mais donc vous vous arrangerez entre vous, en fait. Donc, merci. Donc, la parole est aux Pays-Bas. Merci.
Merci bien, pas de problème. Now, thank you for organizing this meeting, and thank you to Hastu and Jacques for the presentation and documents provided. They were a bit late, but I can imagine these are always very busy times, so we understand. I wanted to start with a general comment, and that is related to many discussions that we have, but particularly also to the grant compensation framework. And that is that the unfortunate but harsh reality is that the political dynamics in many donor countries are not turning towards more grants. The Netherlands as well, we have just received a headline agreement for our future government, which might include quite substantial ODA budget cuts. And this is not, we are not alone. There are many more countries in the Eurozone with these kind of dynamics. And I think the Asian Development Fund replenishment was a signal of what could be the trend going forward. In this regard, I think, like many of my other colleagues said, option one is not viable going forward. And these kind of numbers, presenting them to our political leadership, will not fly, unfortunately. Now, to the paper, in our opinion, we think that the options 1 to 4 could be elaborated a bit better, and especially option 2 and 3. In terms of what would be the consequences and how would they, if you do the calculations, how would it affect the long-term payments that we need to do as donors? Now on option 2 in specific, the option 2 and the impact of market borrowing option are not yet clear. And we also wanted to sort of get a grasp of the option 1 and the current state, to what extent grant compensation is now needed to make the market borrowing option possible. Because the way we understood it before is that the market borrowing option is not a completely isolated solution, but not dependent on the grant compensation framework per se. So a bit of elaboration on this could help. On option 3, with the let's say super highly concessional loans, we noticed that this is also being discussed at IDA, and IFAD also has some experience with long-term loans. Of course, we don't want to jeopardize the debt sustainability, but I think in addition, we should also not imagine that all red light countries are the same. This is not an homogeneous group. There are very big differences in terms of liquidity problems or long-term structural solvency problems. And especially countries with short-term liquidity problems, we think that highly concessional loans with long tenors could be a viable solution. Now, the question is, what would be the impact on grant compensation for option 3? It's definitely something that we want to explore further. Another point, and that was mentioned by the American colleague, is the 7.5%. And I think here it's about a balance. Right now we have, 34% and 7.5. There's a big difference in between. And maybe exploring what kind of options could be in between would be a nice addition for the next time. Maybe we should also contemplate an option 5, and that was mentioned by a lot of colleagues, and that is abandoning the grant compensation framework altogether. And I think this is one of the options that is definitely maybe outside of the box, as my US colleague said. But for the overview, I think we need to have this in there going forward. Now, on the options on timing, on the upfront payment and the encashment schedule, I think here what we see is that compressing an encashment period is mathematically very interesting, but I think politically it is less so. And I think that counts for many options, unfortunately, especially when it comes to upfront payment options, by the way. What also doesn't seem to be addressed is the fact that grant compensation will remain very high in any case. I mean, some options can be more effective, but if you look at the sheer scale of the increase, even with some of the other options in the future, the grant compensation is still large. And in that sense, a cap, how painful it might be on grants, could be a solution to deal with this increase in grant compensation. Now, going forward, we have 2 suggestions also to make it a bit more clear on what all the options actually entail. One is table 8 with the options. The payment options is great, but it doesn't show the cumulative effect on the long term of consecutive replenishments. And I think this is very important to see how it will continue going forward and what the actual difference is. And the other one is table 11, which is great, but it would have been nice to see it per option, per donor. I know that this is a lot of work and asks a lot of calculations, but it would definitely help to see the actual impact of the options for us. Thank you.
Merci. Donc, la parole est à présent donnée à l'Espagne, suivie de la Belgique. Ou peut-être à la Belgique, puis l'Espagne. Désolé. Merci.
Okay, I'll go. Thank you very much. And thank you, Belgium, for letting me skip you. Now, thank you for the documents. As the Netherlands mentioned, it would have great to have more time to analyze them because this is a very complicated subject and there is a lot of data in the document, but we understand it's because the annual meeting is also going on. As other colleagues, we are missing some options in the documents. One, exiting the grant compensation scheme, because as the case for the UK, for us, how we decided to contribute to the ADF, although it may not be ideal, is that it does not fit with the grant compensation mechanism, but because of our budgetary system. So I think that trying to find a system which works with a budgetary system and how we are able to pledge in reality, it could be beneficial for all, for you and for us also back home to understand how the numbers. Also, we could think about revisiting the 7.5 as it was mentioned by the US, or we can think about a new mechanism in which the bank shares the burden together with the donors, the years, for instance, in which there are profits or something like that. So it's not all the burden into the donors. Regarding the options that were presented, option 2, as colleagues, we agree should analyze further, but I don't know if it's something that can be done properly before the ADF actually goes to the market, or if it could be too much assumptions to really know what we are getting into. So I would like to hear back from you on this matter. And regarding option 4, we understand what is proposed is that the burden of the donors would be the same. It's just how we distribute it among ourselves will change. So I could guess those are getting benefited will agree to it. Those that will replace a worse position will not agree to it. But it would be nice to have the figures because right now we don't know how it will affect all of us. And that's all from my side. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier la direction pour la préparation de ce document de réflexion sur le mécanisme de compensation des grants. Depuis la mise en œuvre de l'initiative PPTE, qui avait demandé un effort important de la part des pays créanciers, la soutenabilité de la dette des pays FAT s'est de nouveau considérablement détériorée. Aujourd'hui, 100% des pays FAT sont classés jaune ou rouge. Une telle évolution doit nous amener à nous interroger sur les causes profondes de cette détérioration et nous devons en tirer des leçons. Par ailleurs, nous sommes aujourd'hui obligés de trouver un équilibre entre le volume des grants que le FAT peut offrir et la marge de manœuvre budgétaire toujours plus restreinte dont disposent les pays donateurs. Le document propose 4 pistes de réflexion pour réformer le mécanisme, mais malheureusement, ces 4 options ne sont pas suffisamment élaborées, ce qui ne permet pas d'apprécier les conséquences de chaque scénario pour les pays donateurs et pour les pays bénéficiaires du FAT. D'autre part, plusieurs options n'offrent que des propositions de modifications cosmétiques que nous jugeons insuffisantes. Pour la Belgique, l'option 1 n'est pas une option valable. Le maintien du mécanisme tel que nous le connaissons actuellement risque à l'avenir d'absorber une part trop importante de la contribution des pays donateurs. Le status quo n'est donc pas envisageable pour nous. L'option 4 n'offre pas non plus de solution pour maîtriser la croissance des coûts liés au mécanisme. Il s'agit simplement d'une redistribution de la charge budgétaire entre les pays donateurs sans dispositif de modération des coûts. L'option 2 est pour la Belgique une nécessité. Nous considérons qu'il faut absolument exclure du mécanisme de compensation les nouveaux grants qui seront rendus possibles par l'accès au marché du FAT. Nos autorités budgétaires n'accepteront pas de soutenir une augmentation automatique des compensations qui serait générée par le nouveau mécanisme d'emprunt du FAT sur les marchés financiers. L'option 3 offre en revanche des perspectives plus intéressantes, le fait d'accorder des prêts hautement concessionnels plutôt que des grants aux pays modérément à risque de défaut de paiement, donc les pays jaunes, a clairement donné des résultats. Cette initiative prise dans le cadre du FAT-16 a permis de reprendre le contrôle de l'évolution des coûts alors qu'elle nous échappait. L'option 3 qui propose d'éteindre cette mesure aux pays présentant un risque élevé de défaut de paiement, donc les pays rouges, est selon nous une piste à creuser car elle est la seule à offrir une réelle perspective de maîtrise des coûts à long terme. Mais malheureusement, le document ne représente aucune donnée chiffrée. Il n'est donc pas possible d'en évaluer l'impact, notamment sur le degré de concessionnalité du fonds. Donc, nous regrettons qu'une seule option proposée par la direction réponde réellement à nos attentes et c'est pourquoi nous aimerions que la direction nous propose à l'avenir d'autres alternatives pertinentes accompagnées de scénarios chiffrés. Je vous remercie.
Merci, Belgique. Donc, nous passons à présent au Japon, suivi de la RDC, puis de la Chine. Et encore une fois, vous m'excuserez, je n'ai pas de visibilité sur l'ordre de prise de parole, donc ça sera le Japon, la RDC, puis la Chine. Merci.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So, according to the report, the donor contribution and the grant compensation are projected through, so which is not sustainable, obviously. So the necessity to repeat the mechanism is understandable to ensure its long-term financial sustainability. So our budget is limited, so we should seek all sorts of options to reduce the level of grant compensation and think outside the box for this purpose. So from this perspective, I would like to share our comments on the proposed options one by one. Option 1. Well, it's too early to conclude this discussion, so we have not discussed anything yet. So option 2. I think this could be an effective measure to reduce the level of grant compensation. So we request the management to conduct a further analysis on this option. Option 3. While seeing a merit to reduce our burden, we are afraid that it could affect the debt sustainability of ADF countries. Option 4. It's difficult to assess this option without seeing the impact on the donor contribution. We need to see the results of simulation. And upfront grant compensation. So according to the report, the donor's payment will be very huge in ADF-17, more than 1 billion UA. So we cannot support this option. So finally, I think this is an issue of debt sustainability fundamentally. So I would suggest we should not only revisit the GC grant compensation mechanism, but also should scale up ADF support for debt sustainability under ADF-17. So it should be highlighted in the policy commitment of ADF-17. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour la parole. Je voudrais aussi, au nom de la RDC, remercier la direction pour ces réflexions très pertinentes sur les réformes des mécanismes de financement du FAD. Au regard des besoins de financement croissants et des vulnérabilités relatives à la dette sur le continent, il est essentiel d'assurer la soutenabilité de cet instrument qui nous semble précieux pour nous les bénéficiaires, le FAD. C'est pour ça vraiment nous appuyons, nous soutenons tous les efforts de la banque pour augmenter les ressources du FAD dont les pays bénéficiaires ont vraiment besoin. Alors, je voudrais formuler 3 remarques concernant donc les options qui sont proposées. On comprend que le maintien du statu quo, donc l'option 1, n'est pas une option pour les pays contributeurs, ce qu'on comprend à travers les contraintes budgétaires. Mais d'une manière globale, donc, notre commentaire, le premier commentaire, c'est de dire que notre priorité doit être, conformément aux objectifs fixés par le G20 et en tenant compte des besoins de financement pour le développement qui sont substantiels sur le continent, en particulier dans le contexte d'endettement que nous traversons. Il est important donc d'augmenter l'accès aux dons et au financement concessionnel pour les pays du continent. Je pense que en tant que pays bénéficiaire, pour nous, ça c'est voilà, c'est un élément important de la réflexion qu'il ne faut pas perdre de vue. Deuxièmement, donc comme je l'ai dit, nous n'avons pas analysé toutes les options, mais nous voulons revenir sur l'option 3, qui consiste dans accorder des prêts préconcessionnels aux pays jugés rouges selon la classification du FAD, en lien avec le cadre d'analyse de viabilité de la dette du FMI. Cette option répond à 2 besoins particuliers. À 2 besoins particuliers qu'il faut réconcilier. D'une part, la nécessité d'assurer la soutenabilité financière du FAD, qui peut passer par le fait de réduire le recours aux subventions pour les remplacer par des prêts hautement concessionnels. D'autre part, l'importance dans l'absolu de ne pas ajouter de pression supplémentaire à l'analyse de soutenabilité de la dette des pays dits rouges en leur accordant des prêts hautement concessionnels au lieu de subventions. Mais là aussi, on doit dire que pour un pays en développement avec tous les besoins que nous rencontrons, avec tous les chocs externes, etc., et en matière de résilience, on a beau être pays rouge, face à des situations qu'on rencontre, on est tenté d'aller prendre les ressources là où elles sont, et généralement, elles ne sont pas concessionnelles. Et je pense que je n'ai pas vraiment regardé dans le détail, mais je ne pense pas que la situation d'endettement auquel on est arrivé dans les pays rouges ne sont pas rouges par le fait de s'être endetté auprès de la BAD. C'est d'autres ressources. Et c'est justement le réflexe, bon ou mauvais, on peut qualifier, d'aller prendre des ressources là où elles sont, elles ne sont pas concessionnelles. Donc, c'est pour ça que je rejoins ce qu'a dit le collègue des Pays-Bas, de se dire que tous les pays rouges ne sont pas au même niveau. Et donc, ça peut être une analyse au cas par cas en regardant la situation, mais en tenant compte du fait que les pays ont besoin de ressources. Et donc, des ressources hautement concessionnelles sont meilleures que d'autres ressources auxquelles ils pourraient faire appel. Donc, afin de pouvoir nous prononcer sur la pertinence de cette option, il me semble essentiel d'avoir des indications ou simulations par la BAD de l'impact financier de cette réforme en fonction de plusieurs éléments, notamment une illustration des conditions hautement concessionnelles qui seraient appliquées dans cette option 3 nous semble nécessaire, avec par exemple une analyse de sensibilité de l'impact de cette réforme en fonction des différents degrés de concessionnalité, en considérant des changements des conditions associées aux prêts concessionnels lors du passage au prochain FAD. Et aussi, il serait souhaitable de tester plusieurs scénarios en fonction du nombre de pays classifiés en rouge ou orange afin de comprendre l'impact sur la soutenabilité financière de cette réforme. Troisième remarque, donc plus concrètement et en lien avec le commentaire que je viens de faire, il serait précieux que les équipes de la BAD présentent dans le détail les avantages et inconvénients de chaque option, préférablement qu'elles soient quantifiées. En particulier, une analyse des coûts-bénéfices de ces options est sollicitée, qui préciserait pour chaque option, l'impact sur le bilan du fonds, l'impact sur les coûts de financement des pays concernés et l'éventuel impact sur l'enveloppe mise à disposition par le fonds dans le contexte de chaque option. Merci.
Merci. La parole est à présent à la Chine, qui sera suivie de l'Italie. La Chine.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, we would like to congratulate and appreciate the team. The quality of the documents is very high and based on the opinions and suggestions of the deputies. So the thinking of the framework is very complete and detailed to try to reach the goals of the delegates as much as possible. We think that the proposed framework is also feasible. Congratulate and appreciate the management, especially the finance team, for their meticulous work and great efforts. We support the basic principles expressed in the document, such as the importance of guaranteeing the ADF's concessional lending window, ensuring the long-term sustainability and stability of ADF, to ensure that ADF is a long-term partner of low-income countries in Africa, ensure the active participation and support of ADF donors. So we suggest that the balancing the development needs of RMCs with red or yellow lights, ensuring the sustainability of the ADF grant mechanism and the better achieving development goal by improving the efficiency of use of the funds and the leveraging private sector funding. We would like to express the following general comments and suggestions further. So over the past 15 years, Africa has achieved gratifying results and tremendous development, which shows that Africa has the ability to rely on its comparative advantages to achieve its own development goals, and that there is no limit to the space for future development to African continent. However, Africa's future development will require more and more financial investment, not the charity. And a large funding gap will need to be filled. As long as Africa has sufficient input, it will certainly continue to make greater progress and even achieve economic takeoff. So it must be recognized that there are low-income countries in Africa that need concessional loan, and concessional rates are therefore important. But the amount of grants and the concessional loan is limited and unsustainable in the long term. And such concessional are insufficient compared to the actual amount of financing needed by Africa, compared to its own advantages and the potential. So we don't have to be too obsessed with preferential rates. So I think that my secretary print not full my yeah. Yes, so yes, we support Africa could get more and more concessional capital, and ADF to be as a soft window to support ADF countries. But based on the long term our consideration, and also based on the special important role of the African Development Bank, we support that the bank need to come back to its original business to pursue more big projects, more projects to the small economies and fragile countries, you know, pursue the quality and impacts of the project. Do RMCs cannot do. Leverage more resources to support those economies. Based on the debt clarification, divided the different group of countries, and I don't think it's very good opinions to ADF. Based on the economic original, how GDP, how per capita, how they are, not only based on the debt. The debt, we need to analysis what's the region and how measures to deal with it. But ADF is ADF. You need to put these concessional country, resources on those countries the most needed. So that's my additional. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thanks for organizing this meeting and for the presentation and for the document. Of course, we acknowledge as a premise, we acknowledge the difficulties in balancing the needs of ADF countries and the need to ensure the sustainability of this mechanism. At the same time, we think that for future discussions, as highlighted by the previous delegates, more analysis is needed in order to have a more comprehensive common path and shared path in order to have a comprehensive solution, as the options and the elements presented are somehow not alternative each other, not completely alternative each other, and that can be included in the same potential solution and potential response. Going through the options, we see that, for example, the options 2 has, as already said, market borrowing option and the potential implications of market borrowing options should be excluded by computation, as presented in the option 2. And as regards the option 4, it can be as principle can be considered, but of course we need some more figures and more more perspective and analysis to consider the solution that seems to be and seems to guarantee potentially some kind of stability, more stability, but we want to know more about this option. About just a few words about the shortening the encashment schedule, we think that this kind of solution could, by our side, could impact on the size of our core contribution, and this element we have to consider this element when we are going to pledge if this kind of measure will be implemented. But we expect more analysis to see the feasibility of in the future discussions. Thank you.
Merci, Vitaly. Donc, nous passons à présent à l'Autriche, qui sera suivi de l'Allemagne, puis du Luxembourg. La parole est à l'Autriche. Merci.
Thanks, co-chair. And I will also go option by option. The first option, we have seen the figures for the future grant compensation and how it weighs on the fund, and we think it's of course not sustainable. So this is not an option for us, a viable option. On option 2, we assumed that the market borrowing option was not depending on the grant compensation scheme. So we think this option is a given. On the third option, we are open to any possible adjustments, but such adjustments would need to be made in coordination with the results of the IDA discussions and in coherence with the DSF rules. And we were also wondering what would be the expected level of concessionality of the ADF after such a reform. On option 4, we, as others mentioned already, the burden remains the same on this option. It's just differently distributed, but of course it would be good to have figures on what implications this would have to change the burden, to change the division among donors on each donor's expected compensation under this new formula. And as others have already mentioned, we would like you to introduce an option 5 that follows the model that has been adopted by IDA and IFAD, and that does not single out funds needed for grant compensation within a donor's contribution anymore. We think it is difficult, as was already mentioned by others, to explain to ministers why the ADF would be different than the other funds, and why only a certain part of our contribution would actually be regarded as replenishment. And we also would like to make the point that has already been made by others, that the fund would probably not get additional contributions by maintaining the grant compensation scheme as it is because of political realities. And on the proposal to shorten the encashment schedule, we cannot support this proposal. Possible Austrian future AFDF replenishment contributions are locked into a 10-year encashment schedule within our national budget planning framework now already. That means that we cannot simply switch. And if the encashment schedule would be shortened to 3 years or anything below 10 years, then any planned contribution from our side would need to be significantly reduced, and certainly by more than 10%. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And thanks to management for the paper. I think we are all clear that we need a revision of the grant compensation scheme. However, the paper shows that it's not an easy thing. It's very important to have this discussion, to start the discussion, to have it and to try to find a comprehensive solution. First of all, I think we have to still stay open in mind and looking for different options and solutions in between also, to find an option that a right balance between the needs of the countries and the support to the countries, the ADF countries, the financial sustainability and relevance of the fund, and also the financial capacity of the donors. it's very difficult to have a clear opinion on the already on the different options. We would need to have more details on the consequences of each of them, and also where are compromise in solutions in between possible. We agree with others that we are supportive to option 2, and because we think that market borrowing should strictly improve the fund's financing capacity without imposing an additional fiscal burden on donor countries. With regard to option 3, I think we would need to have more information on the pros and cons, and also if there is possibility to change the 7.5 limit. We would also see the need to include the option of skipping the whole scheme. With regard to the early encashment, we absolutely see the political, especially the political consequences that may have. On the first sight, it seems like a positive to get more transparency and to have more clarity on the contributions, but I think also that it's possible politically very difficult to follow up on this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to make a improvised intervention, as my Dutch colleagues already mentioned pretty much everything I wanted to mention. But already just to say actually that I think it's no surprise for all of us that the current model, it doesn't work. Perhaps it does today, but at least in the figures that are presented for ADF-25, it doesn't. And I see the model which is presented today as a fatalist model, because we're basing ourselves on red figures, on which are actually, as we said today, okay, 34% of them. Sorry, I don't remember anymore how much of the percentage of countries which are red, but it's actually quite a big amount. And we're basing ourselves for ADF-25 based on this model. So hopefully, by then things will improve. Now, taking a bit more of a positive approach, I think that, I like the expression of leave no stone unturned. And by this I just have to say that option 1 is not an option. Option 2 on the no capital market fund inclusion in the grant compensation mechanism, that is also for me a given. And by this, I want to remind that on the market access, the bank and the fund have proven to be at the forefront of innovation. We talk about the hybrid capital and so on. So, here is where I go back to what USA said before on the think outside of the box and perhaps bring other solutions. Option 3, and this is the point that I wanted to actually mention, which is close to what our Dutch colleagues mentioned, is the 7.5. Why not analyzing something between 34% and 7.5? I mean, we can, of course, not say that we need to take into account the particularities of the ADF. IDA has a much more advantageous scenario given the geographical interventionist landscape. But not all the red countries are red red, sorry. For this to work, we'd have to be like a close work with the IMF data and a clear framework in order to be able to work on a more concessional framework than the currently proposed method. On option 4, categorization, I see this as passing the ball to the smaller one. So for this, of course, it's not a go for Luxembourg. On the upfront payments, I think that more information is required at this stage. This has already been mentioned before. And on the shorter encashments, I mean, I see very little benefit already has been discussed before. You know, perhaps we could align 1 year with IDA or even 1 or 2 years, but this is not going to make the big difference in terms of present value. So I think there's more to be explored at this moment. Thanks.
Merci. Donc, avant de donner la parole à la Suède, je voudrais juste rappeler que malheureusement, on a une contrainte de temps par rapport à l'utilisation de cette salle. Il y a une autre réunion qui est prévue juste après la nôtre. Donc, dans le peu de temps qui nous reste, nous allons essayer un peu d'optimiser aussi bien les interventions que les conclusions qui vont être partagées. Donc, la parole est à la Suède. Merci.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will be brief because we're still analyzing the paper. And I want to say thank you for the updates. We appreciate the efforts to find a solution that strikes a good balance here. Our preliminary views are very much in line with those of a majority of previous speakers. We don't see option 1 as sustainable. We would look favorably upon option 2, but that we would also have seen as a given. And when it comes to the whole, overall, we would welcome if all the options could be more elaborated, including an analysis of impact in terms of trade-offs, consequences for individual donors, and how the options relate to each other. As others have mentioned, to have a fully comprehensive analysis, the paper would benefit from covering a scenario where the grant compensation mechanism is abandoned to get the full picture. And lastly, a shortening of the encashment schedule would need to be carefully calibrated as it might meet limitations in donors' national budgetary systems. Thank you.
Sorry for my colleague from Egypt. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be very brief. In terms of the analysis that was mentioned by a lot of the colleagues, we would like to see the effect on beneficiaries. It's very important. I think also the point that was raised by our colleague from China was very valid. Grants is not a very sustainable solution. However, also the impact in terms of giving sudden shocks to the beneficiaries are really an important aspect to be taken into account. I think the last point, which is the alignment with IDA, I think if there is an option for close alignment, it has to be done in a complementary way. Again, it's the regional scope and the allocation of funds should not affect the African RMCs negatively. So complementary approach is required if we're gonna do full harmonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, honorable deputies. So just for the sake of time saving, I will skip the part where I would normally have to wrap up and maybe try to present a recap of everything that has been said. And I give the floor to Madame Hassatu for her concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and let me thank you for this rich conversation and your remarks. They are much appreciated. They provide clarity as to the positions and to the path that we might want to take. There are just so many possibilities, so it's important to iron out the path that we should take. So first, I just want to contextualize the grant compensation framework. So donors specifically requested that ADF should shift essentially from a concessional loan provider and provide grants to red light countries. And donors at the time indicated that they would compensate the fund. And donors chose how they would do it, the pay-as-you-go approach.
So we understand that we are at a stage right now where it's becoming difficult because the amounts are growing and the number of countries that are, requiring grants is increasing. We understand that, for some budget, it includes both the grant compensation and the contributions that donors would make to ADF. So therefore, we shouldn't expect more resources from that envelope. We also heard that it could be detrimental to ADF, that we don't change our compensation framework because some donors would choose to shift to IDA, for example, versus ADF, because we also heard that it would be difficult for the authorities to understand why ADF would be treated differently versus IDA. And one thing that I can assure you of is that if we were getting 30% of what IDA is getting, we would absorb fully the grant compensation. Just wanted to say that. So we note that there is zero appetite for option 1, so we're putting it off the table. For option 2, we had indicated in the market borrowing that it would be part of the grant compensation, but we note the position and accept that it would also not be an option. Option 3, more in-depth analysis is going to be provided. With regards to option 4, on the FAIR formula, so that was something that we thought of, last minute. More reflection is going to be put into that and analysis provided. We also note that for the upfront grant payment, there are different levels of appetite. For some, it's a no, and for some other, let's see what it looks like with options. So we will look into that. But here it is a zero-sum game, okay? It is a zero-sum game. So it is who pays the bill. So we have schemes like an encashment schedule that is similar to IFAD would help, or even smaller. There is no consensus. Some are yes, some are no, some are analysis. So we'll provide analysis on various scenarios, 3 years, 6 years, what it means. Upfront grant compensation, again, there was no, and maybe let's look at the analysis so we can look at variations of upfront payments. But again, a zero-sum game. So it's either the donors that pay, the ADF that pays, meaning that its capacity is reduced, or the ADF countries that pays, meaning that they don't get as many grants. So this is the box that we are in, and innovation has its limits. So donors, with this conversation, you are fully, in a sense, removing yourself from the pictures because you don't want grant compensation. So so we can work on that. So what it means is that if it's ADF that supports the grant compensation and that supports the grant, it means that basically we are agreeing that the ADF envelope is going to be reduced for everyone, for red light countries, for all the ADF countries, because remember that the grant compensation is what underpins the advanced commitment capacity. ADF-17 was 8.5 billion, if I'm not mistaken, and the larger portion came from the advanced commitment capacity. So we need to accept that. The envelope going forward at ADF is going to be reduced. So it's not countries, you're not getting grants, you're getting concessional loans. It's countries, you are getting grants, but even the smaller amounts. So we just need to understand and agree with that. So impacting the financial sustainability of the fund in the context of the market borrowing, in-depth analysis is needed. Not available in the immediate, I cannot commit to that, but it's something that we will absolutely work on in order to have something that makes sense for all. We have the path forward. We will provide more in-depth analysis and provide various options that you're going to be looking at and indicate, which one works best, what works best for you. I cannot commit to July. Okay. And I just want to make sure, because we have the ADF midterm review and everything, but we know that this is important for donors, especially in the context of ADF-17. And rest assured that whatever proposal, because at the end of the day, it is your decision, right? So, I mean, I can talk for 1 week, it is your decision. But we'll make sure that you take an informed decision. That's our role, so that you can see what are the pros and cons of the various possibilities. And if there are other ideas that we can put forward, in the meantime, we will. So thank you very much. So what we'll do though is that for option 4, as we think about that, we will have some bilateral discussions to try and see, what could work, and while we work on the ADF grant compensation. Thank you very much.